Tonight, we're exploring the history and impact of one of the most pivotal military operations of the late 20th century, Operation Desert Storm. This swift and highly coordinated conflict reshaped the Middle East, redefined modern warfare, and introduced the world to high-tech combat on a global stage. With satellite-guided missiles, international coalitions, and real-time news coverage, Desert Storm marked a turning point in how wars were fought and watched. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you are watching. Now, let's begin our journey through this powerful chapter in history. We hope it helps you learn while you sleep. In the early morning hours of August 2, 1990, the world awoke to a geopolitical shock. Iraqi troops, under the orders of President Saddam Hussein, crossed the border into Kuwait, a small, oil-rich kingdom nestled on the Persian Gulf. Within hours, the capital city, Kuwait City, was seized. Tanks rolled through quiet streets. Soldiers stormed government buildings. The Kuwaiti royal family fled. And just like that, one sovereign nation had swallowed another. To the world, it was an act of naked aggression, and it demanded a response. Saddam Hussein claimed the invasion was a matter of justice. Iraq accused Kuwait of slant drilling into Iraqi oil fields, of flooding the oil market and crippling Iraq's economy, already fragile after its 8-year war with Iran. But most global leaders saw something different, a dictator who had just seized control of over 20% of the world's oil reserves. For the United States and its allies, this wasn't just a regional conflict, it was a threat to global stability, energy markets, and international law. Within days, the United Nations condemned the invasion. Resolution after resolution demanded Iraq withdraw. When Hussein refused, the world began preparing for war. President George H.W. Bush, speaking from the White House, announced the launch of Operation Desert Shield, a massive deployment of U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia, designed to defend it from a possible Iraqi attack and to prepare for what might come next. The scale of the coalition that formed was unlike anything since World War II. Over 35 nations pledged support, militarily, logistically, financially. From the United Kingdom and France to Egypt, Syria, and even some former Eastern Bloc states, the world stood in rare unity. For months, coalition forces poured into the Arabian Peninsula. Jets screamed overhead, warships patrolled the Persian Gulf, and armored vehicles kicked up dust across Saudi sands. By January 1991, the coalition had positioned more than 900,000 troops, with over 500,000 from the United States alone. Meanwhile, Iraq entrenched itself. Saddam believed the U.S. wouldn't risk a land war in the desert. He deployed nearly 1 million troops, fortified the Kuwaiti coastline, and filled the desert with bunkers, trenches, and landmines. Most infamously, he positioned Scud missiles, threatening Israel and Saudi Arabia with long-range rocket attacks. In Baghdad, Saddam declared Iraq would fight a mother of all battles. His regime broadcast defiance, boasting of chemical weapons, elite Republican Guard divisions, and a battlefield that would swallow American invaders whole. But behind the rhetoric, the world braced for something far more precise, and far more devastating. As January 15, 1991, the UN deadline for Iraq's withdrawal passed with no movement from Baghdad, war became inevitable. In the early hours of January 17, as darkness cloaked the desert sky, the coalition unleashed a storm unlike anything modern warfare had seen. Stealth bombers slipped silently into Iraqi airspace. Cruise missiles arced from ships in the Persian Gulf. Fighter jets, AWACS surveillance planes, and electronic warfare aircraft filled the air. Command centers, airfields, communication hubs, radar sites, all were targeted in a meticulously coordinated campaign. The world watched in awe and horror as television networks broadcast the war in real time. Green-tinted footage of missiles striking their targets lit up the night from rooftops in Baghdad. It was the first true televised war, and millions tuned in to see it unfold. Operation Desert Storm had begun. But while the air war dominated headlines, it was just the beginning of what would become one of the most decisive, and controversial military campaigns of the late 20th century. The first wave hit Baghdad just before 3 a.m. local time on January 17, 1991. Coalition aircraft, from stealth bombers to cruise missiles launched from ships in the Persian Gulf, pierced through Iraq's air defenses with devastating precision. It wasn't just an airstrike. It was the beginning of what military planners called shock and awe. In less than 24 hours, Iraq's radar systems were jammed, its command centers disrupted, and much of its anti-aircraft infrastructure reduced to rubble. For viewers at home, the war looked almost surreal. The green glow of night vision footage lit up television screens around the globe. Anchors whispered over the eerie silence of explosions in the distance. The Gulf War was the first conflict broadcast live, moment by moment, into millions of living rooms. And in this strange new theater of war, perception became almost as important as power. The coalition's goal was clear: destroy Iraq's military capacity without launching a ground invasion. Yet, over the next 5 weeks, more than 100,000 sorties would be flown. Aircraft from 14 different nations participated in the aerial assault. American F-15s, British Tornadoes, Saudi F-5s, and French Mirages filled the skies. They targeted missile silos, oil refineries, weapons depots, airfields, roads, and bridges. Iraqi power plants were bombed to prevent the regime from coordinating resistance. But it wasn't only the infrastructure of war that was hit. Iraq's communications network, its ability to move supplies, and its political institutions were also systematically degraded. In Baghdad, government buildings lay in ruins. Saddam's palaces, symbols of his power, were targeted to send a clear message. The air campaign also focused on crippling Iraq's vaunted Republican Guard, a collection of elite military units loyal to Saddam. Satellite-guided bombs pounded armored divisions hiding in the desert. Convoys were destroyed before they could reach the front. Iraqi soldiers, cut off and under siege, began to surrender by the dozens. Yet Saddam refused to yield. Instead, he tried to change the game. In the days that followed the opening assault, Iraq began launching Scud missiles toward Israel and Saudi Arabia, hoping to fracture the fragile coalition. Saddam believed if Israel retaliated, Arab nations like Syria and Egypt might withdraw from the alliance with the West. Israel was hit 39 times. Cities like Tel Aviv and Haifa were shaken by air raid sirens. Residents donned gas masks, fearing chemical attacks. But under intense pressure from the United States, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir held back. Patriot missile systems, deployed by American forces, intercepted many of the incoming Scuds. The coalition held together. Meanwhile, another war was being waged beneath the surface, a technological war. For the first time in military history, precision-guided munitions were used on a wide scale. Laser-guided bombs and GPS-based systems allowed pilots to strike targets with pinpoint accuracy. Television-guided missiles even allowed real-time visual confirmation of hits. The results were staggering. In just a few weeks, Iraq's military capabilities were reduced by over half. Entire divisions were immobilized. Airfields were cratered and useless. Fuel and ammunition depots erupted in massive fireballs visible for miles. But as the coalition pounded Iraqi forces, humanitarian concerns began to rise. Civilian infrastructure had been hit. Power and water were scarce in Baghdad. Aid organizations warned of a looming crisis. The world watched, captivated and conflicted, as the campaign unfolded. By mid-February, the air war had achieved its objectives. The skies belonged to the coalition. Iraq's command and control were shattered. And now, the stage was set for the next act. The ground war. It would be swift, brutal, and decisive. At 4 a.m. on February 24, 1991, after 39 days of relentless aerial bombardment, the coalition launched the ground phase of Operation Desert Storm. The desert was quiet, but the tension was electric. Then, the silence broke. Thousands of tanks roared to life, kicking up waves of sand. Armored personnel carriers, mechanized infantry, and artillery columns surged forward across the Kuwaiti and Iraqi borders. The goal was clear: liberate Kuwait, cripple Iraq's military, and do it with speed, precision, and minimal casualties. Leading the charge was the U.S. 7th Corps, one of the most powerful armored forces ever assembled. Flanked by the 18 Airborne Corps, British and French divisions, and troops from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and other coalition partners, they executed a massive left-hook maneuver, a wide, sweeping strike through the open desert of southern Iraq, designed to encircle and crush Saddam's elite forces. It was a strategy built on deception and surprise. For weeks, coalition air and naval forces had fixated on Kuwait's coastline, giving the impression that an amphibious landing was imminent. Iraqi commanders shifted troops to defend the beaches, leaving the western desert exposed. Now, that vulnerability was being exploited with overwhelming force. The U.S. Marine Corps and Arab coalition troops hit the Iraqi lines head-on in Kuwait, while the main thrust, led by Abrams tanks and Bradley fighting vehicles, punched deep into Iraqi territory. The Iraqi army, already battered from the air, crumbled under the pressure. Many Iraqi soldiers were young conscripts, poorly trained and poorly equipped. They had endured weeks of bombing with little sleep, little food, and no reinforcements. Thousands surrendered without a fight. In some sectors, white flags went up even before the first shots were fired. But not everywhere. The Republican Guard, Saddam's most loyal and capable units, put up fierce resistance. In battles like Medina Ridge and 73 Easting, American and coalition forces faced coordinated tank assaults, dug-in positions, and minefields stretching for miles. At 73 Easting, a clash between U.S. armored cavalry and Iraqi Republican Guard units became one of the largest tank battles of the war. American troops, aided by GPS and thermal imaging, devastated enemy positions, often spotting Iraqi tanks before they were even visible to the naked eye. The technological gap was vast. Coalition aircraft provided close air support, knocking out enemy bunkers, columns, and artillery. Drones and satellites guided artillery strikes with unprecedented accuracy. Night vision gave coalition troops a decisive edge in the desert darkness. It was 21st century warfare waged in the sands of the 20th. And the pace was blistering. In just 100 hours, coalition forces advanced over 300 miles, routed 42 Iraqi divisions, and liberated Kuwait City. By February 27, U.S. Marines had entered the city to cheering crowds. Kuwaiti flags waved. Portraits of Saddam Hussein were pulled down and burned. The once vaunted Iraqi army had been shattered. President George H. W. Bush addressed the nation the next day. Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met. But even as victory was declared, the images on the television screens began to change. Columns of retreating Iraqi troops, vehicles, and equipment were being obliterated by coalition aircraft along a stretch of highway leading from Kuwait to Basra. It would later be known as the Highway of Death, a grim reminder of the overwhelming imbalance between the retreating force and the coalition's technological might. The world had witnessed the most rapid and one-sided ground campaign in modern military history. But questions lingered. Why wasn't Baghdad taken? What would happen next? And had the seeds of the next conflict already been planted in the sands of the Gulf? The battle was over. The aftermath had just begun. As the dust settled over the battlefield, one thing was clear: Kuwait was free. On February 27, 1991, coalition forces entered Kuwait City, ending 7 months of brutal Iraqi occupation. But what they found inside the capital was not triumph, but trauma. The streets were scarred, lined with burned-out vehicles, looted shops, and blackened buildings. Smoke curled into the sky from thousands of fires, set deliberately by retreating Iraqi forces in a final act of destruction. Over 700 oil wells had been ignited, spewing choking smoke across the desert, and blotting out the sun for days. It was a scene from hell, the sky dark, the ground scorched, and the air thick with the stench of crude oil and war. Kuwaiti citizens, many of whom had endured the occupation in silence or fled abroad, emerged into the streets to greet coalition troops. Some wept. Others cheered. Flags were waved. Prisoners were released. And yet, the celebration was muted by what had been lost. Under Iraqi rule, torture chambers, summary executions, and systematic looting had plagued Kuwait. Palaces were stripped bare. Museums were emptied. Even hospital equipment had been stolen and shipped north to Iraq. The goal had not just been conquest, it had been humiliation. In the days that followed, the coalition helped restore basic services, secure infrastructure, and support the re-establishment of the Kuwaiti government in exile, which returned home in triumph. But there was no question, this was a city that had been held hostage, violated, and left in flames. Across the border, the retreating Iraqi military was in full collapse. Thousands of soldiers threw down their weapons and tried to flee northward. Many were caught on the infamous Highway of Death, a 6-lane road littered with the charred remains of tanks, trucks, and bodies, an image that would come to define the war's brutal finale. Coalition air forces hammered convoys from the air, under orders to prevent Saddam from regrouping. But as the footage aired worldwide, critics questioned the morality of the destruction. Was it self-defense, or overkill? Back in Washington, President George H.W. Bush made a defining choice. Despite calls to continue on to Baghdad and remove Saddam Hussein, the president stood by the original mission: liberate Kuwait, not topple Iraq's government. On February 28, just one day after the liberation of Kuwait City, Bush announced a ceasefire. Operation Desert Storm, he said, had achieved its goals. The war was over. But even in victory, the region was far from peace. In southern Iraq, Shia Muslims rose in rebellion, hoping for support from the Americans, support that never came. In the north, Kurds launched uprisings, only to be crushed by Saddam's elite Republican Guard. The world watched in horror as refugees fled into the mountains, braving snow and starvation. These humanitarian crises would haunt the legacy of the war and raise questions about what the coalition could, or should, have done next. In Kuwait, the cost of war was visible everywhere. Environmental disaster loomed. The fires set in the oil fields would burn for nearly a year, releasing toxic chemicals into the atmosphere and threatening long-term health effects for those who remained. But amid the ruins, one truth remained: a nation had been saved. The international coalition had held. The largest alliance since World War II had fought together, and won. Still, this victory came with consequences, some immediate, some still unfolding decades later. And for the men and women who fought, the memories of the war would remain, marked not only by tanks and missiles, but by smoke, silence, and the shadow of unfinished business. When President George H.W. Bush declared a ceasefire on February 28, 1991, the world breathed a sigh of relief. Operation Desert Storm had lasted just 43 days. It was swift, technologically advanced, and by many metrics, overwhelmingly successful. Kuwait had been liberated. Iraq's military had been decimated. The coalition had held firm. But as the fighting stopped, a different kind of struggle began, one filled with complex diplomacy, humanitarian crisis, and moral uncertainty. The ceasefire agreement, signed at Safwan airfield in southern Iraq on March 3, 1991, imposed severe restrictions on Saddam Hussein's regime. Iraq was ordered to recognize Kuwait's sovereignty, disclose all weapons of mass destruction, and accept inspections by the United Nations. But even as Iraqi generals agreed to the terms, Saddam showed no intention of stepping down or changing course. In the weeks that followed, two uprisings erupted inside Iraq, both inspired, at least in part, by President Bush's earlier words, encouraging the Iraqi people to rise against their dictator. In the south, Shia Muslims took to the streets. In the north, Kurdish groups launched their own rebellion. Saddam responded with brutal force. His Republican Guard crushed the revolts, massacring civilians, destroying towns, and leaving hundreds of thousands dead or displaced. The coalition, unwilling to violate the ceasefire terms or risk destabilizing the region further, did not intervene. For the rebels and civilians, this was a devastating blow. Many had believed the United States would continue the fight to Baghdad, to finish what had started. Instead, they were left to face Saddam's wrath alone. The humanitarian crisis escalated quickly. Over 1.5 million Kurds fled into the mountains along the Turkish and Iranian borders, many without food, shelter, or medical care. Harsh weather and exposure led to mass death, particularly among children and the elderly. In response, the United States and its allies launched Operation Provide Comfort, a massive relief effort to deliver food, water, and medical supplies to the refugees. Military aircraft dropped aid from the sky. Medical teams rushed to build makeshift hospitals. The mission saved lives, but also highlighted the tragedy of what hadn't been prevented. Meanwhile, in Kuwait, recovery was slow. The oil fires continued to burn, creating an environmental disaster visible from space. Thick black clouds drifted across the desert. Oil lakes formed where pipelines had been ruptured. It would take nearly a year, thousands of firefighters, and an estimated $1.5 billion to fully extinguish the flames. In Washington, debates raged. Some praised the restraint of not marching to Baghdad, arguing that toppling Saddam would have mired the U.S. in an occupation without international support. Others believed the coalition had stopped short of true justice, leaving a dictator in power and setting the stage for future conflict. Internationally, United Nations sanctions were imposed on Iraq, restricting trade and access to vital supplies until Saddam complied with disarmament. Over time, these sanctions would cripple the Iraqi economy, isolate the population, and contribute to growing resentment in the region. For American soldiers returning home, there were parades, celebrations, and a sense of national pride. Unlike the Vietnam War, the Gulf War had a clear mission and a clear victory. Yet for many veterans, the experience left scars. Some began reporting strange illnesses, fatigue, rashes, memory loss, and chronic pain. Over the next decade, this would become known as Gulf War Syndrome, a poorly understood condition linked to chemical exposure, vaccines, or stress. The government was slow to acknowledge it, and thousands struggled without support. The war was over, but it had unleashed shadows that would linger for years. The ghosts of Desert Storm had begun to speak, not through gunfire, but through memory, consequence, and the uneasy quiet that follows a victory with unfinished business. With Kuwait liberated and the guns of Operation Desert Storm silenced, the coalition shifted from war to containment. Saddam Hussein remained in power, and though his military was crippled, his ambitions were not. The post-war years became a battleground of a different kind, one of surveillance, sanctions, air patrols, and diplomacy. And at the heart of it all were the weapons of mass destruction Saddam was suspected of hiding. As part of the ceasefire agreement signed at Safwan, Iraq had agreed to disclose and dismantle all chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons programs. The United Nations created a special task force, the United Nations Special Commission, UNSCOM, to enforce compliance. Teams of international weapons inspectors entered Iraq to search for banned weapons and ensure destruction of existing stockpiles. Almost immediately, the process turned into a tense game of cat and mouse. Iraqi officials obstructed inspections, hid documents, and moved equipment. Inspectors were delayed, followed, and denied access to suspected sites. Though some weapons were discovered and destroyed, including large quantities of chemical munitions, many more remained hidden, or were claimed to have been destroyed without verification. Meanwhile, the UN imposed strict economic sanctions on Iraq, limiting the country's ability to import food, medicine, and technology. These sanctions were intended to pressure Saddam into compliance, but they also devastated the civilian population. Hospitals lacked basic supplies. Infant mortality soared. Malnutrition spread. Saddam's regime used the suffering to blame the West, fueling propaganda and deepening anti-American sentiment across the Arab world. To prevent further repression and retaliation against Iraq's minorities, particularly the Kurds in the north and Shia in the south, the United States and its allies established no-fly zones. These air exclusion areas were enforced by Western fighter jets, patrolling daily to prevent Iraqi aircraft from operating in certain regions. In March 1991, Operation Provide Comfort evolved into a longer-term military presence. The northern no-fly zone, above the 36th parallel, protected Kurdish areas from Iraqi helicopters and fighter planes. In the south, another zone was established above the 32nd parallel to shield Shia communities from renewed air attacks. These missions were not symbolic. U.S. and British planes frequently engaged Iraqi anti-aircraft systems, striking radar sites and surface-to-air missile batteries when threatened. These skirmishes, though often brief and precise, turned the Iraqi sky into a silent battlefield that lasted for more than a decade. Inside Iraq, Saddam used the no-fly zones as further justification to tighten control. The Ba'ath Party cracked down on dissent. Opposition groups were hunted, imprisoned, or executed. His grip on power, despite defeat, remained ironclad. Internationally, the question loomed, should the coalition have finished the job? Many argued that by not removing Saddam Hussein, the West had missed a chance to stabilize the region. Others warned that such an effort would have led to a bloody occupation, fractured coalition unity, and costlier long-term consequences. Meanwhile, Iraq continued to posture. Saddam presented himself as the lone Arab leader who had stood against the West, defiant, wounded, but unbroken. His image appeared on murals and posters throughout Baghdad. His speeches blamed Zionism, imperialism, and betrayal by the Arab world. But behind the bravado, Iraq was isolated, impoverished, and heavily monitored. UN inspectors returned again and again, and every refusal, every standoff, only deepened the divide. The Gulf War was over, but the standoff had just begun. A decade of tension was unfolding, brick by brick, in skies filled with invisible lines and on streets lined with the scars of war. And as the world watched, the seeds of future conflict were quietly taking root. Operation Desert Storm was not just fought in the desert, it was fought on television screens across the globe. For the first time in history, a war was broadcast in real time, with reporters embedded alongside troops, satellites relaying live feeds, and news anchors narrating military strikes as they happened. This was the birth of the 24-hour war, and its impact would be lasting. Networks like CNN became household names, their correspondents delivering nightly updates from hotel rooftops in Baghdad and military bases in Saudi Arabia. Viewers at home watched green-tinted night vision footage of missiles streaking through the sky. The glowing tracers, the flashes of distant explosions, it looked surreal, almost like a video game. The narrative was tightly managed. The U.S. military, wary of the media chaos during the Vietnam War, created pooled reporting systems, briefing centers, and press guidelines to control what was shown and said. And to the public, the war seemed clean, efficient, and just. It was a war of precision-guided munitions, high-tech weaponry, and quick victories. A war of minimal U.S. casualties and overwhelming force. A war that showed the world what American military power looked like in the modern age. But behind the polished footage were complex realities that rarely made the screen. The coalition's use of smart bombs was impressive, but not infallible. Civilian infrastructure was struck. Water treatment plants, bridges, and even shelters were destroyed. In one of the most controversial incidents, the Amaria shelter in Baghdad was hit by 2 laser-guided bombs on February 13, killing over 400 civilians, most of them women and children. The Pentagon believed it was being used as a command post. Iraqi officials opened the site to journalists, displaying the charred remains. The footage aired worldwide, raising questions about targeting intelligence and the moral weight of high-tech warfare. War had become a spectacle, and with that came new ethical dilemmas. Some critics accused the U.S. of portraying the war as bloodless, emphasizing technology over tragedy. Others argued that the media had been too compliant, too restricted, too eager to accept official briefings without challenging the broader consequences of the campaign. Still, the images that did make it through shaped a generation. The Highway of Death, a stretch of road littered with the burning remains of retreating Iraqi vehicles, became one of the war's most haunting visuals. Bombed from the air, those convoys showed a defeated army in retreat, but also sparked global debate. Was it a necessary military strike, or an act of excessive force? Public reaction was split. For many Americans, Desert Storm felt like a moral redemption after the trauma of Vietnam. It was short, successful, and seemed to prove that U.S. military force could be both effective and restrained. President George H.W. Bush's approval ratings soared. Soldiers returned home to cheering crowds, ticker-tape parades, and welcome home banners. But for others, especially in the Arab world, the war was a reminder of Western dominance, double standards, and the complexities of international intervention. It deepened suspicions of U.S. motives and increased regional instability that would resonate in years to come. The war also raised new questions about the future of warfare itself. Could wars be won with air power alone? Was television a tool for truth, or a veil for sanitization? And how did public opinion shift when conflict was packaged, edited, and delivered like entertainment? Operation Desert Storm didn't just reshape the battlefield. It reshaped how the world saw war. And as screens flickered with images of burning oil wells, shattered bunkers, and victorious troops, a new era was quietly beginning, one where perception was as potent as power. The last bombs of Desert Storm had fallen, the ground campaign had ended in victory, and Kuwait was free. But across Iraq, the dust of defeat settled into something far more enduring, a simmering, fractured nation gripped by isolation, devastation, and defiance. At the center of it all was Saddam Hussein, wounded politically, but still in power. His army battered, his economy shattered, yet his grip on Iraq remained ironclad. In the war's immediate aftermath, the United Nations Security Council passed a series of resolutions aimed at containing Saddam's regime. Chief among them was Resolution 687, which required Iraq to disclose and destroy all weapons of mass destruction, WMDs, and long-range missile programs, and to allow international inspections. In theory, it was a logical follow-up to the ceasefire. In practice, it became a new kind of war. UNSCOM, the United Nations Special Commission, was given the monumental task of hunting down Iraq's WMDs. But what began as cooperation quickly turned into confrontation. Iraqi officials stonewalled inspectors, denied access, and concealed documentation. Convoys were delayed at checkpoints. Suspected facilities were emptied or scrubbed clean. The cat-and-mouse game had begun. Then came the revelations, shocking, at times incomplete. UNSCOM discovered advanced programs in biological weapons, including anthrax production, and hints of nuclear ambitions far beyond what had been previously disclosed. Despite this, the full extent of Iraq's WMD stockpiles remained elusive. Saddam's message to his people was one of resistance. On Iraqi state television, he portrayed the regime not as a defeated aggressor, but as a survivor of Western imperialism. Propaganda showed triumphant parades, patriotic songs, and images of destroyed American tanks, many of them fabricated or heavily edited. Outside the borders, the story was much different. Iraq's economy was in ruins. The UN sanctions, intended to weaken the regime, ended up crippling the population. Imports were blocked. Currency collapsed. Food and medicine became scarce. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies. Infant mortality soared. Once educated professionals now begged in the streets. The world debated the morality of the sanctions. Some saw them as necessary pressure. Others saw a slow-moving humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in plain sight. Reports from UNICEF and the World Health Organization painted a dire picture. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqi civilians, many of them children, were dying not from war, but from economic suffocation. And yet Saddam endured. His security services suppressed uprisings. His political opponents vanished into prisons. His inner circle remained loyal, bound by tribal alliances, fear, and fortune. Iraq had become a fortress under siege, not just by bombs or planes, but by policy and time. Meanwhile, U.S. forces remained in the region. Bases in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar housed American troops, aircraft, and weaponry. These deployments, while intended for stability, also stirred unrest. Many in the Middle East viewed the prolonged presence as a provocation, especially with holy lands like Mecca and Medina nearby. Tensions were rising not only in Iraq, but beyond. And in the shadows, a new generation of militants watched, radicalized by images of civilian suffering, political hypocrisy, and foreign soldiers on Arab soil. One of them, a Saudi exile named Osama bin Laden, would soon become a name the world would never forget. Desert Storm had ended with celebration and confidence. But in its aftershocks, new fault lines were forming. Lines that would stretch across decades. Lines that would explode again, in towers, cities, deserts, and distant capitals. The war was over. But its consequences were just beginning to unfold. In the wake of Operation Desert Storm, the Middle East did not return to peace. It stepped into a new, volatile era defined by power vacuums, oil politics, and a growing undercurrent of anti-Western sentiment. Although the United States and its allies had delivered a decisive blow to Saddam Hussein's military, they had left him in power. Iraq remained economically strangled, politically defiant, and socially fractured. Sanctions choked the country's infrastructure, while Saddam's regime tightened its grip internally and continued its cat-and-mouse game with international inspectors. At the same time, the United States cemented its military footprint in the region. American bases were now permanent fixtures in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the broader Gulf. Though the intention was to deter further aggression, it sent shockwaves through Arab societies. For many Muslims, the presence of foreign troops on Islamic soil, particularly in the homeland of Islam's two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, was a profound offense. One of those angered by this was Osama bin Laden, a former Mujahideen fighter in Afghanistan who now publicly denounced the Saudi monarchy and the West. In 1992 and again in 1996, bin Laden issued statements declaring war on the United States, calling for jihad against American forces occupying the Arabian Peninsula. He blamed the U.S. not only for supporting corrupt regimes but for the suffering caused by sanctions on Iraq and the deaths of Muslim civilians during the war. The ripple effects of Desert Storm were expanding in unpredictable directions. Meanwhile, oil remained at the heart of the region's strategic importance. Though protecting oil wasn't the stated goal of the war, it was undeniable that economic security played a central role in coalition decisions. The Gulf housed nearly two-thirds of the world's oil reserves, and stability, or the appearance of it, became a matter of international interest. In the years that followed, the oil market fluctuated wildly, influenced by OPEC decisions, regional instability, and Iraq's restricted production. Saddam used oil as both leverage and propaganda, insisting that sanctions, and the West's thirst for petroleum, were the real enemies of the Iraqi people. At the United Nations, debate intensified. Humanitarian groups decried the ongoing sanctions, which continued to starve the civilian population while leaving Saddam's regime largely untouched. In response, the Oil for Food program was established in 1995, allowing Iraq to sell limited oil in exchange for food, medicine, and essentials. But the system was rife with corruption and manipulation. Through all of this, Saddam Hussein remained defiant. He survived coup attempts, outlasted his regional rivals, and continued to harass UN weapons inspectors. In 1998, after repeated confrontations, Iraq expelled the inspectors altogether. That same year, the US and UK responded with Operation Desert Fox, a 4-day bombing campaign targeting military and industrial sites. But even then, Saddam endured. In Washington, the political consensus began to shift. Many believed Saddam was biding his time, secretly rebuilding weapons programs, and preparing for another confrontation. Reports from defectors and intelligence agencies were often unclear, but the fear of unfinished business from Desert Storm loomed heavily. At the same time, the U.S. homeland felt far removed from the region's tensions, until September 11, 2001. The attacks on New York and Washington, carried out by al-Qaeda, changed everything. They were the clearest expression of how the post-Gulf War world had metastasized into a new, deadlier era of global conflict. From the ashes of Desert Storm, a new war was rising, not over borders, but beliefs. Not against states, but shadowy networks. And in that storm's center stood the lingering image of Saddam Hussein, unfinished, defiant, and soon to be the focus of another invasion, far more complicated and far more costly. Operation Desert Storm officially ended on February 28, 1991, but its impact would resonate for decades to come. In just 6 weeks, the United States and its allies had demonstrated a new form of high-tech warfare, fast, overwhelming, and televised in real time. The success of the campaign became a template for modern military strategy, but also a source of controversy and consequence. The war reshaped global perceptions of American military power. Precision-guided weapons, real-time satellite targeting, and electronic warfare had turned the tide in the coalition's favor, and showed the world what a digitally coordinated force could accomplish. Generals spoke of a revolution in military affairs, and Pentagon planners began to restructure future conflicts around the model of Desert Storm. But what couldn't be digitized was the human cost, and the long shadow cast by political decisions made in its wake. One of the most debated legacies was the choice not to remove Saddam Hussein. President George H.W. Bush and his advisors feared that advancing to Baghdad would fracture the international coalition, entangle the U.S. in a prolonged occupation, and destabilize the region further. The mission, they argued, had been to liberate Kuwait, not regime change. Yet by the mid-1990s, many Americans, especially those in political and military circles, had begun to believe that the job had been left incomplete. The image of Saddam Hussein, still ruling defiantly from his palaces, became a symbol of unfinished business. His defiance during weapons inspections and his continued repression of internal dissent only added to that perception. This belief would eventually shape the next war in Iraq, launched in 2003 under President George W. Bush, the son of the man who had led Desert Storm. That war, marked by occupation, insurgency, and deep division, would contrast sharply with the clean, swift precision of 1991. Still, for many veterans and military strategists, Desert Storm represented something rare in modern history: a war with a clear objective, a defined beginning and end, and a decisive outcome. The coalition had formed swiftly, acted with purpose, and returned victorious. It was the closest thing to a textbook victory the post-World War II era had seen. But there were also less visible legacies, like Gulf War syndrome, a chronic illness affecting thousands of American and Allied veterans. For years, the U.S. government struggled to define and treat the condition, which included symptoms such as fatigue, memory problems, joint pain, and respiratory issues. Some linked it to chemical exposures, others to vaccinations, stress, or environmental toxins from burning oil fields. On a global scale, Desert Storm reshaped U.S. foreign policy. It reinforced America's role as a post-Cold War superpower and deepened its military presence in the Middle East. Bases built to support the Gulf War became permanent, and relationships with Gulf monarchies grew closer. But so too did resentment in parts of the Arab world, resentment that would fuel extremist ideologies in the years ahead. Culturally, the war left a deep imprint. It influenced film, literature, military doctrine, and political rhetoric. It birthed a generation of service members shaped by victory and the complicated realities that followed. And in the years that followed, one truth became increasingly clear. While Desert Storm may have ended with victory parades and waving flags, its true legacy lay in what came after, in the wars it inspired, the questions it left unanswered, and the patterns it etched into the future of global conflict. The sandstorm had passed, but the wind had shifted, and the world would never be the same again.